I never thought my life would take such a sharp turn, but here I am, piecing together the fragments of what used to be my reality. It all began with a single moment that shattered everything I believed about love and loyalty. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact second when things started falling apart, but I can tell you when I realized my perfect marriage was a lie. Emily and I met at a friend's party. It was one of those magical nights where everything just clicked. Her laugh was contagious, her energy magnetic. Within months, we were inseparable, sharing dreams of the future and swearing we'd never let anything come between us. Our wedding was straight out of a fairy tale, and for a while, our life followed the same script. But as the years passed, cracks began to form in the facade. At first, they were easy to ignore. Emily started coming home later than usual, blaming it on work deadlines and last-minute client meetings. She was always the ambitious one, so I brushed off the late nights, the distant look in her eyes, and the rare, almost forced smile she gave me. Love makes you blind, they say, and I was no exception. The first real jolt came when I found a pair of her underwear beneath the passenger seat of her car. It was a rainy Thursday, and I had borrowed her keys to fetch something she'd left behind. The fabric was torn, as if they had been ripped apart in a hurry. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe they got caught on something, or it was an old pair she forgot about. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. I tried to shake it off, but the thought festered in the back of my mind. Weeks turned into months, and the distance between us grew. Conversations became surface level, filled with polite nods and forced laughter. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find her side of the bed empty. She'd always have an excuse, a last-minute report, a sudden call from a colleague. But something about her demeanor felt rehearsed. I started to question everything. Was she hiding something, or was I losing my mind? The breaking point came when I decided I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. One Friday evening, I told her I had a work trip and left the house early, circling back to park a block away. From the shadows of my car, I watched as she dressed up in a way she hadn't for me in years. She seemed nervous but excited, glancing at her phone every few minutes. Then he arrived. Derek, her boss, pulled up in his sleek black car, and she climbed in without hesitation. My heart sank, but I needed proof. I tailed them at a distance, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. They drove to a hotel on the outskirts of town. Watching them enter together felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I sat in the parking lot, my mind racing. Should I confront them, storm inside, and make a scene? Or should I wait, gather more evidence, and plan my next move? My world had crumbled in the span of an hour, and I had no idea how to pick up the pieces. All I knew was that the life I thought I had was gone, replaced by a dark, unrecognizable reality. Sitting in that parking lot, staring at the hotel entrance, I felt like I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing. I wanted to storm in and confront them, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was a realization that no confrontation would undo what I'd just seen. Instead, I drove away, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I needed to leave. Staying meant living with the pain, the lies, and the constant reminders of betrayal. The idea of packing up and disappearing felt impossible, but the thought of staying felt worse. I found myself at a bar a few miles from home, nursing a drink and trying to figure out my next move. That's when I met Mason. Mason was the kind of guy who looked like he'd seen it all. He was sitting at the bar, chatting with the bartender, and somehow we struck up a conversation. I didn't tell him everything, but I must have looked like a man on the edge because he offered me a way out. He mentioned a trailer he owned, a small, run-down thing parked near the woods. It wasn't much, but it was quiet and away from everything. Without thinking too much, I accepted. The next few days were a blur. I started secretly moving my things into the trailer. Clothes, important documents, anything I thought I'd need to start over. I'd wait for Emily to leave for work, Then I'd load up my car and make the trip. Every time I stepped back into our house, I felt like I was suffocating. The memories, the photos on the walls, the scent of her perfume, it was all too much. There was a part of me that wanted to confront her, to yell, to demand answers. But another part of me knew it wouldn't matter. She'd made her choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. I needed closure, and I needed to take control of my life again. On the last day, I left a note on the kitchen table. It was short, just a few words. I know everything. Next to it, I placed my wedding ring. I didn't wait to see her reaction. I didn't want to. The house, the marriage, the life we'd built. It all felt like a weight I had to shed. Walking out that door for the last time was both the hardest and the easiest thing I've ever done. The trailer was nothing fancy. It smelled of damp wood and was barely big enough for a bed and a small table. But it was mine. Sitting outside, staring at the trees, I felt a strange mix of freedom and emptiness. I wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The pain was still there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, but at least now, I had the space to figure out what to do with it. Life in the trailer started slowly but steadily. The mornings were quiet, with the sound of birds and the wind through the trees replacing the chaos that used to fill my head. I began to find peace in the stillness, something I hadn't felt in years. At first, it felt strange, almost unnatural, to be away from everything, but over time, it started to feel like freedom. I began cutting back on drinking. Mason's influence, perhaps, or maybe just my desire to feel in control again. I even started getting to know a few people in the area, mostly through the small coffee shop in town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Then the messages from Emily began. At first, they were short and tentative, like she was testing the waters. She apologized for being distant, claimed she missed me, and begged me to come home. I ignored them. Every buzz of my phone felt like a tiny earthquake, shaking the fragile balance I was trying to build. When I didn't respond, the tone of her messages shifted. The apologies turned into accusations, as if her betrayal was somehow my fault. She said I had been absent, that I hadn't given her the attention she needed, that the stress of her job had driven her to make mistakes. Reading those words felt like pouring salt into an open wound. She admitted to the affair, though she didn't call it that. She called it a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. She blamed the long hours at work, the pressure of deadlines, and my supposed emotional distance. It was a twisted justification, an attempt to rewrite the narrative to make her the victim. Each message was another weight on my chest, another reminder of why I had left. I kept my distance. The idea of engaging with her, of letting her pull me back into that toxic cycle, was unbearable. I deleted most of her messages without reading them fully, but the ones I did see only fueled my resolve to stay away. I'd spent too long being the one to compromise, to smooth things over, to make excuses for her behavior. Not this time. Despite everything, a part of me still hurt. The love I'd felt for Emily didn't just disappear overnight. But every time I thought about responding to her, about giving her a chance to explain, I remembered the sight of her walking into that hotel with Derek. That image was burned into my memory, a permanent scar that no amount of words could erase. One evening, as I sat outside the trailer watching the sunset, my phone buzzed again. I didn't bother looking. I knew it was her. The messages came like clockwork, a mix of pleading and anger, apologies and justifications. But I was done. I had to be. The quiet around me was a stark contrast to the chaos she brought into my life, and I wasn't ready to give that up. Not yet. Maybe not ever. It was bound to happen eventually, but I didn't expect it so soon. One crisp morning, I decided to grab coffee at the little shop I'd started frequenting. It had become a safe space, a place where I could sit and think without the weight of my old life pressing down on me. But as I stepped in, I froze. Sitting at one of the tables was Emily. She looked different. There was something about her posture, the way she held her coffee cup as if it were the only thing anchoring her. For a moment, I considered turning around and walking out, but she spotted me before I could. Her eyes lit up with a mix of surprise and desperation, and before I knew it, she was at my table. Emily wasted no time launching into her apologies. She spoke quickly, her voice trembling as she explained how everything had fallen apart since I left. She'd lost her job. Apparently, word of her affair with Derek had spread, and the fallout had been brutal. Derek, she claimed, had been just as spineless as I imagined, distancing himself from her the moment things got messy. She described the shame she felt walking into her office, the whispers of her colleagues, and the crushing realization that her choices had left her completely alone. Listening to her was surreal. This was the same woman who had confidently walked into a hotel with another man, who had tried to justify her betrayal with flimsy excuses about stress and neglect. Now, she was here, pleading for a second chance, promising that she'd changed, that she understood the gravity of what she'd done. Her words were filled with regret, but they rang hollow to me. I couldn't shake the image of her messages, the way she'd tried to twist her guilt into my failure. She reached for my hand, her voice breaking as she begged me to come home. She claimed she'd do whatever it took to make things right, that she'd learned from her mistakes. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something, sympathy maybe, but it wasn't enough to overshadow the anger and disappointment that still lingered deep within me. I told her no. My voice was calm but firm. I explained that trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired. Her betrayal wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice, one that had shattered the foundation of our relationship. I told her I had already filed for divorce and that there was no going back. Her reaction was immediate and intense. She broke down, tears streaming down her face as she tried to argue, to bargain, to say anything that might change my mind. But I stood my ground. I had to. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about protecting myself. I couldn't go back to a life filled with doubt and pain, no matter how much she claimed to have changed. Leaving the coffee shop, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sadness, of course, but also relief. For the first time, I felt like I had truly closed that chapter of my life. The day of the court hearing was colder than I expected, a sharp wind cutting through my jacket as I stood outside, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Emily was there, of course, looking as though she had spent hours preparing for this final confrontation. Her eyes met mine, pleading silently, but I kept my focus straight ahead. I knew what she wanted, and I knew what I had to do. As we stepped into the courthouse, she made one last attempt to change my mind. Her words spilled out quickly, a mix of apologies, promises, and desperate rationalizations. She insisted that we could rebuild, that the mistakes she'd made didn't have to define us. But every sentence felt like a ghost of the life we'd once shared, hollow and fading. I told her, as gently but firmly as I could, that trust was the foundation of any relationship, and hers was irreparably broken. For both our sakes, we needed to move on. That was the last thing I said before we entered the courtroom. The process was straightforward, though emotionally draining. When the judge declared our marriage dissolved, I felt a strange weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't happiness, exactly, but a sense of finality, of closure. Walking out of that courthouse, I knew I had made the right choice, even if it still hurt. The weeks that followed were a time of reflection. I thought back to the man I'd been when this all started, unsure, angry, clinging to the remnants of a broken relationship. Now, my life felt simpler, quieter. The trailer, once a symbol of my escape, had become my sanctuary. I spent my days working, reading, and exploring the woods nearby. It was a far cry from the life I'd imagined for myself, but it was mine, and that was enough. It was during one of my trips into town that I met Lauren. She was running a small booth at the farmer's market, selling handmade pottery. There was something about her, a warmth, a calmness, that drew me in. We started talking, first about the pottery, then about life. She mentioned she'd moved to the area after leaving a toxic relationship, and I felt an instant connection. Over time, our conversations turned into coffee dates, then dinners, then something more. Lauren was everything Emily wasn't: steady, kind, and honest. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could trust someone again. A few months later, I bought a small house on the edge of town, and we decided to move in together. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt like a fresh start, a place where we could build something new together. As I sit here now, looking back on everything that's happened, I feel a sense of peace I never thought I'd find. Emily's betrayal could have destroyed me, but instead, it forced me to rebuild. I've learned that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that set you free. If there's one thing I'd want anyone reading this to take away, it's that you're stronger than you think. Don't let someone else's actions define your life. You can move forward. You can find happiness again. I did, and so can you.